Hello, this is Philip Lawrence Carter, and today I'm reading my short story entry for the fiction assignment thing. And I wrote this back in January, February, March, April, May, June, July, 22nd of July 2009. So, it's not very good. Also, I've opened the old document with bad grammar, so pardon me for a second. There we go. Cold air reached the lungs and brought the being to life. He pushed out the cold and looked into the funnel, the only other entity in this void. It swirled black and purple before him, and he wondered if it had consumed whatever was once all around. The ground stretched up to meet it, and little flecks of white were sucked away into the vortex. It looked into him, trying to fathom his purpose. He stood there unaffected by the vortex, anchored to the bending ground by some unknown force. The cold wind pressed into his mouth once more, bringing an alien sensation to the roof. He raised his arms in curiosity, and put his fingers in his mouth. He felt around for whatever had caused the sensation. He came into contact with a cold surface, unlike that of the rest of his face. He tugged on the cold and dangling object on the roof of his mouth, dragging it closer to his teeth. He felt a familiar shape, a zip. He continued to pull this zip as his mouth cracked and popped open in its wake. His tongue fluttered upwards and inspected the rupture. There was no blood. Perhaps this zip was here to be pulled. The whole roof of his mouth began to unpeel. The popping became regular and calming as the zip carried on towards his teeth. It arced over them and out of his mouth towards his upper lip. His front teeth slowly beginning to part from each other. It made his way to his wordless lips. He sighed in awe as the zip split the lip. There was no pain or blood, just wisps of smoke and the familiar crackling sound. The wisps glided gently up in front of his eyes and wrapped around each other in helix shapes. He gently pulled the zip over the tip of his nose as the wisps dissipated and became infatuated with the void before him. He watched as they spiraled into oblivion. The zip now travelled over his nose and between his eyes. He looked at it for the first time, noting each intricacy and blurred detail between his eyes. The chrome of the thing reflected his own skin tone. He was deathly pale, but he still pulled the zip onwards. Now it had reached the centre of his forehead. He paused. He felt a blinking sensation behind the zip, and for the first time in his life, he felt blind. It was as if one aspect of his perception had been cut off, and he was about to allow it through. As the zip continued upwards, he felt light pressing into this third optical receptor. His hidden eye blinked for the first time under natural light. His head slowly began to part with a dull squelch as tendrils of veins and blood receded into their resident halves. He continued to guide the zip onwards, ignorant to this new sensation. It parted his hair and made short work of his scalp. Soon enough it was at the tip of his spine. Here it stopped, clicking to a halt and refusing to go any further. The man had completed the journey. The spinning vortex in front continued to gnaw at reality as he stared forwards. His eyes grew further apart as gravity drew the loosely connected sides of his head downwards. He felt his head opening like a blossoming flower. Something stirred in the centre of his brain, the hidden eye. It wriggled a sinewy tail and fluttered upwards into the air. Suddenly, a grey hand snatched the little entity from its flight path, dragging it back towards the man. He could not turn to face whatever owned the hand, for the vortex had captivated him. But he swatted the arm away and grabbed the entity that had left his brain. He lifted it high and admired it before releasing it, allowing its slimy mass to float freely in the air. His head remained open as the glowing thing swam around in front of the vortex, shedding bursts of red and blue light into it. The oblivion collapsed in on itself, forming a perfect sphere of black and blue. It swirled as the flying eye orbited it. The man watched as they danced together. The flying eye suddenly plunged into the black sphere, nestling its tip in the surface and burrowing inside. The black planet became transparent, showing the man the journey his tertiary eye was making. It continued to wriggle inside the planet, navigating towards the core. There it merged and melted within the core, spreading its blue and red lights across the inside of the planet like decorations. The man watched as spikes and dents began to form in the planet. It began to assume human shape. It shook into a human form and walked into him. They became one. He was much taller now, too tall for the white void to contain him. His eyes opened and he sat up. He felt around his neck for the zip and pressed the sides of his head together to see if they would fit. There was no sign of the zip. His head was in the right place. He checked his mouth and felt the cold object once more. It had moved back to its starting place, but now, as he poked it, it fell onto his tongue and dissolved. He stood up and shook his head, yawning and closing his eyes. He could still see. Ta-da! The end!